So, welcome back everyone to the Uncast podcast. Now, we know it's been a while since there's been an episode of Uncast, but we're thrilled to announce that the podcast is back and better than ever. Now, I'm your new host, Ed, and I couldn't be more excited to get stuck into this role. Now, I've always believed that the Uncast podcast is a really valuable source of information for the listeners and also great entertainment. And I promise to continue that tradition with thought-provoking discussions and engaging content. But please bear with me as I settle into this new role, which is actually quite different from making YouTube tutorials. And I'll probably make a few mistakes on the way, like mispronouncing people's names, but I'll do my best not to. Now, I really want the podcast to be full of engaging content, and so what I want to do is be able to give you, the audience, a way to be able to actually interact with the podcast by asking questions. And no, this is 2023, so not writing an email or putting a comment in YouTube. Basically, I want you to be able to actually record a question that you want to have on the podcast. And to do that, we're going to be using a service called Speakpipe, which will allow you to actually record a question that you want to have asked on the podcast. And this is done in a very similar way to what you kind of do an answer phone message, but you've got the opportunity to kind of re-record the message as many times as you like, and then when you're happy, you can just click submit and shoot me across a message. So where can you do this? Well, just head across to speakpipe.com/uncast and you can record your message there. Now, of course, you can ask me questions about Unraid, or anything that we've spoken about on the podcast before, but what I think it'll be really cool for is for you to be able to ask questions to upcoming guests on the podcast, so I'll try and keep you informed of who's going to be on and when, and that way it will give you the opportunity to actually be able to ask the guests on the podcast your own questions. Oh yeah, and when you actually record your question, please actually say, if you mind, if we use your recording in the podcast and actually play it on the podcast and play it to the guest. If you don't want to, then please say so, and I can just listen to your question and then ask the guest in my own words. But I'd much rather be able to play the best questions on the podcast directly to the guests and get their response. So if you're feeling brave and you want to ask a question, don't miss this opportunity to get your voice heard. So like I said, in order for you to ask questions, you need to know who's going to be on the podcast. Now, obviously, you're not going to be able to ask today's Uncast guest any questions, but very soon we're going to have Tom Mortensen on the show, who's the CEO and founder of Lime Technology and the original creator of Unraid. So I'm sure you guys have got many questions you might want to ask him, so send across your questions to Speakpipe. Remember, the address is speakpipe.com/uncast. Anyway guys, sit back and relax and get ready for an exciting new season of Uncast. I can't wait to share my thoughts and ideas with you, and I also can't wait to hear from you as well. Anyway, thanks for tuning in, and let's jump straight in and have our first guest, who's Bob from Retro RGB. Hi there guys, so today we've got a really interesting guest, Bob from Retro RGB.
I am honored to be your first guest. I'm a fan of yours, of course, Ed, and also a fan of Unraid. I've been using it for a year and a half now, and usually I'd be toasting with a beer, but it's very early for me. So cheers with the with the diet soda. But yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you, and I definitely want to ask. We'll do a reverse interview at first here because I have a bunch of Unraid questions, and we did an interview last year. You kind of set a lot of people up in the retro gaming scene for what this is, but for anybody who's just joining us on either side, your crew or my crew, I guess a very quick opening is Unraid is an operating system that runs on a USB stick that allows you to take basically any computer and turn it into a NAS, a networked attached storage. And one of the biggest questions I got after our interview was, how is this different from just buying a NAS box from Amazon? And is it better? And is it better is always down to your scenario. No disrespect to anybody, but how is it different is any hard drive you have, and if there's a catastrophic failure, lightning strikes in your computer and 2 of your 5 drives blow out, you could still recover the data that's on those last 3 just by plugging it into a Linux machine. Did I get that right?
Exactly, yeah. So, Unraid runs off a USB stick. The operating system loads from the USB stick into RAM, and you can use a mixture of any hardware you want. You don't have to use all of the same brand hard drives, all of the same size.
I think that's one of the biggest things that really appealed to fellow nerds like myself because so many of us have spare computers lying around. So to start out and do this, I think it's really great. I do have to address the our fellow IT nerds who are listening. Every time we talk about Unraid or Raid, there's always somebody that loves to raise their hand and say, "Actually, Raid is not a replacement for a backup." We know. We already know that. So just politely, don't worry. We got this. But yes, I personally I use mine both way, three ways actually. I back up my main storage drive on my desktop to Unraid. I have my movies that I ripped all my Blu-rays on there, and I stream from there. But I back the movies up to some external USB drives that I have laying around, and I have RetroNAS run in a virtual machine, which we'll get to shortly, of course. So I use mine for many different purposes. But one of the things that I definitely wanted to bring up for both of our audiences here is most of us these days have more spare laptops laying around than desktops. And I messed around with Unraid in a laptop and I didn't get it working, but I had problems getting it working, but this was also when I was very new to it. Since you're the expert, I'd love to hash that out because I'm sure there's a lot of people listening, doesn't matter if they're retro gamers or not, that have a laptop that say, "Can I start with this?" And I basically took a beat up old laptop. I took a couple to try this, by the way. It doesn't even matter if the screen is dead. Plug it into a VGA monitor just to set the BIOS to boot from your USB stick, and don't worry. But I plugged the USB stick into the USB 2 port because it loads into RAM anyway, so that doesn't matter. And then I plugged one of those Mediasonic USB like 4-in-1 boxes into the USB 3 port. And once again, IT person in the back of the room, I know. USB 3 is not sharing four drives into one is not this is meant to be a backup, not a high speed storage thing. So, and I had it all laying around. But the problem that I kept running into is that every couple of reboots, because you know me, I have to mess around with it constantly, but every couple of reboots, the drives wouldn't be detected fast enough, and I would have to go back and delete the array. So, I know there's been many updates to Unraid. Is there a way to say when it boots, like, obviously you could do the delay in your BIOS, but I'm talking about your operating system reading all four of those drives in the Mediasonic box. Is there a setting in Unraid where you could say if all four or all 20 or all two, whatever drives aren't detected, just pause and verify, or does it kind of mess with the array every time that happens?
No, I think you're going to find that, if it doesn't detect the drives, then, you're always going to kind of run into that problem. Possibly if you set Unraid so it didn't auto start, you may find then that, when you actually start up the server, the array will start stopped, but then that would mean you'd have to go in and manually start the array. So,
And if anybody hasn't seen this, when we say manually go in, you still do not need a monitor connected to this setup. You could just do it through a browser on your phone, through your
exactly,
PC,
yeah.
whatever. So that's interesting because that was a problem I ran into a lot, and that's what prevented me from having a fun second Unraid. Like, I just said I keep my movies on just USB drives. I would have had a second Unraid setup with all of those drives in one on that, not very well made USB contraption thingy that I built, but yeah, that's interesting. So that's a good way. I wonder if the team would consider building some kind of protection like that in because I almost lost my array a few times when one of the controllers I had went down. So one of the drives went down. Luckily, it was only one drive plugged into that controller because most of them were plugged into the SATA ports on the motherboard, but one of them was plugged into an external controller in the PCI slot. And when that went down, if there had been two or three drives plugged into that, I might have lost the whole array from that one. So
Yeah. Even if that had happened, Bob, you would have still been able to recover because even though the drive's not being detected, because they're plugged into a USB external caddy thing, then yes, Unraid could drop them out of the array because it can't see them, but you wouldn't lose the data. All you'd have to do is make a new configuration for the array and then put the drives back in the order they were before.
In the drop down menus and
in
everything.
the drop down menu. Like, so long as you don't select the parity as a data drive, then you'll be good. So you wouldn't have lost anything, but it's just a pain to have to do that. Definitely.
Yeah, but that's why I wanted to bring this up, just to give my fellow nerds peace of mind here that, because I think anybody that's been in, especially anybody that's been in IT, but anybody that's really into technology, the older you get, the more you have trust issues, because the more you've put trust into platforms or hardware, and it's inevitably going to let you down. So this is the other reason why I'm stuck with Unraid, mostly to find out that it was my fault when things went bad, by the way, just to put that out there. But the reason I've been sticking with it is because of every time something weird happens, I'm able to just have that array still there, and I didn't lose all that time and data. And the other thing to mention too that I was blown away about was that I've probably gone through 5 different desktop computers since I started my array, and every time moving it from one computer to the other is power it down, plug the drives into the new computer, plug the USB drive into the new computer, set it to boot from USB, and that's it. Some config with the VM stuff, which we'll talk about, but like the array was still there. I mean, that's kind of unheard of. When in your life have you had a RAID box, a hardware RAID, where when you wanted to switch it to a different computer, you just move the drives over? Like that's not a thing. So
Yeah, it's just so awesome not to have to worry about, swapping the hardware. As far as the server's concerned, everything's exactly the same. It just detects the hard drives and sees them there, and if it can see them, it's happy. So, but like you say, with the VMs, yeah, there can be kind of different things to do. But anyway, Bob, kind of how did you actually discover Unraid in the first place?
my friend Risha, who's one of the Mr. developers for the Mr. FPGA project, she was the one that really pushed me towards it. And my old man grumpy ITness kicked in, where I was just like, I don't want to try a new platform. That just seems like more things to go wrong. And she was in a very polite and loving way, was like, shut up and listen. You should try this, and I did. And not only did I like it, but I started to see the potential of what else it could do. And this is my plague right here, because my whole life I've always seen what things are and I see what they could do, and I try to make them do it. And unless I work with a development team, which is basically what my day job's been like since 2006, unless I'm actually there working with the team, I always try to stick a square block into a round hole. And even though I know I can make it fit somehow, and that is kind of one of the things that got me excited about it. And I have run into some trouble, which you've been a help trying to get me through. But I would love to see in the gaming and both retro and modern gaming scene multiple uses for this, because that's kind of a thing. It's certainly a big deal for me. I don't have the money to buy a streaming box and a NAS computer and a main computer and a backup computer. So when you started, actually, I started watching your videos talking about VMs and then talked with you about it in our podcast. The thought of having something that's all right, here's a decent PC. It's not garbage. It's within 10 years old. The specs are good. It's not the bottom of the barrel processor, but by no means is it a fast and expensive computer. But I have that. I got a bunch of drives in it. I install a capture card, and now I have a VM that's a dedicated capture VM. So I'm utilizing the same computer for two things, but I get all of the advantages of a dedicated computer, whereas I only boot it when I'm streaming or capturing. So I didn't just install a program that has a driver update that screwed up my whole setup. Like it's like having a dedicated computer. And I think that's something that, that's all gamers might really want something like that. So, I guess, would you mind? I know, apologies to anybody who listened to our other podcasts and stuff, but would you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I just think that's such a huge deal for people that want to try something like this.
So yeah, for a lot of people, when you swap PCs, it's kind of a lot of work to get it set up and running. But because you're using a VM and you've got your capture card pass through, if you went tomorrow and bought a new PC, probably within half an hour, it's all going to be working exactly as it was. And as far as the VM's concerned, it's running in the same hardware because all the hardware is virtualized.
While you're 100% right, I actually think the opposite is the more important factor. And I mean this respectfully, but there's been a couple of times where I moved my Unraid over to a new computer, I plugged in the capture card, and the VM doesn't work because I had to remap a bunch of stuff. Now the capture card doesn't work. Now the capture's freezing. And I went, oh man, I screwed this whole thing up. But I just removed the capture card, rebooted the Unraid server, and everything's still there and everything's perfect. So the main use of that machine, the my Unraid server is very important to how I work and play with the movies, but it's the secondary use was the thing that I had problems with. But I always was able to go back and, okay, I'll deal with capture later. I can just bring my laptop over or whatever else for now, but the main use was still there. And I think that's what was so important. All of my frustrations of trying to square peg round hole things didn't affect the file storage. And there's always a danger, right? You could go in and manually delete your drives, but that's also like saying, oh, is it dangerous to mod a video game console in the bathtub with a soldering iron plugged into a wall? Like, yeah, if you make real stupid decisions, yes, but for the most part, you're good to go.
But I think a lot of the problems you may have been having with your VM is when you swap hardware. I think it's always a good idea to remove all of the pass-through hardware from the VM template out of the VM before you actually shut down the server, because the hardware will be given a virtual address um, linked to a physical address, and that physical address will be different in a new motherboard. And so that old XML gets kind of left behind in the template, and then when the VM starts up, it's referencing other hardware that may or may not exist in this PC.
I think one of the tricks that you taught me last time is a very good workaround for this if your setup allows. If you have a motherboard that has, let's just say, USB 2, USB 3, and USB 3.2 ports, you, in many cases, can isolate the faster ones, the 3.2, let's just say. And so you boot from the USB 2 because it doesn't matter. And then you have that other USB port dedicated to your VMs. And as long as you only have one VM running at a time, that is where you connect your devices. Connect a USB capture card, connect, USB microphones and audio interface or whatever else. So it really makes it so much easier. You basically just get your VM configured like a basic virtual machine with whatever your OS of choice is, and then the USB devices just kind of work as is, and you don't really need to worry about it. I wanted to ask though, have you tried that with Thunderbolt at all?
I don't think that passing through Thunderbolt will work because it's dependent on the actual kind of like motherboard itself. So you may pass through, I may be wrong. The Line Tech guys watching this may go, "Hey Ed, you're talking a load of crap." But how I understand it is the motherboard is kind of responsible for the Thunderbolt. So actually passing through the Thunderbolt on its own, it isn't enough, because there's other parts in the motherboard that the pass-through Thunderbolt would be dependent on. Because when we make a virtual machine, we're basically making a virtual motherboard and then popping bits of hardware into that motherboard. And so that's why I don't think that Thunderbolt would work.
I will let you know in a week or two because I plan on trying that. I promise you I'm not going to go off on a tangent here, but I've just had a reputation for the past 20 years of breaking everything. And I don't mean like with a sledgehammer. I mean like I got flown out to Intel's headquarters once because I found a bug in their upcoming chipset. They were like, "No, you didn't." And they flew me out and they're like, "Oh shit, you did, huh?" So I found a bug in Thunderbolt. I know it's such a pompous thing to say. Why is some fat guy from America finding a bug in a major architecture? But I think I did. So I've been working on trying to figure out why that's happening. And I know other companies have found it too because of restrictions. Once again, I won't go off on that tangent, but I did a very quick test run on this machine and it saw the Thunderbolt controller as something that I could pass through. I didn't try it yet. So my hope would be that in a situation like this, you could share the controller itself with a VM. So it works essentially like USB. You could just plug in whatever device you want. I think if I do get it working, you would have to map the device. So the whole plug and play thing would be out the window and you might as well just use an internal one anyway. But that's a Thunderbolt thing, not an
Hmm.
Unraid thing. So, but I
Right,
will report back to you with that one in a week or two.
cool. Yeah, I'd be very interested to know if it works. I'm an AMD guy, so there's very few motherboards that have Thunderbolt on AMD platforms. So
Yeah. You know, the honest truth is to why I'm still using Intel. When I got this 3060 graphics card, the only way I was able to purchase it because of the graphics card shortage was if it was bundled with an Intel-based motherboard. So I was like, well, I guess I'm buying an i9. So that was I had no preference.
my brother did exactly the same when he got his 3070. It came with the motherboard, so he ordered it, and I think the next day put the motherboard on eBay, and
I should have
yeah,
done
it's
that.
exactly the same.
Yeah, I should have done that, but I stuck with this one in ASUS. So while this is not directly related to Unraid, here's a fun tip for all of my fellow nerds here. This was an ASUS motherboard. The only BIOS available on their website was the one that it shipped with. And I probably wasted a month of my and my friends' times. And some people who do this for a living, who their time should not be wasted, but we couldn't figure out why I couldn't get this working. Uh, and it turned out the Thunderbolt controller, the external card that you have to put in, was bad, and the BIOS revision, the launch release of the BIOS was bad. As soon as I swapped out the card, then things sort of worked. But then as soon as I did the BIOS update, it started working. So if you're having a crazy problem like that, take a step back and maybe if your motherboard is returnable, maybe grab another one because that was a nightmare. I wasted all of February of last year trying to figure out why nothing was working right.
We've been talking about Unraid for a bit, but for all the people who don't know who you are, can you tell me a bit about yourself and your YouTube channel, what Retro RGB is?
Sure. So, Retro RGB is a website, YouTube channel, podcast, and everything else that you could imagine tied into that I started just over 10 years ago that helps people get started and stay up to speed with everything going on in the retro gaming and retro display world. And for people that don't understand why anybody would care, I totally get that, by the way. But it's exactly like classic cars or older music, right? Just because maybe something was made or released before you were born has zero bearing on whether you like it or not. Some of my favorite songs came out last year, and some of them came out 10 years, 20 years before I was born, and it makes no difference to me. And it's the same with video games. So if you love the sound of that old muscle car and you love the way it feels when you nail the gas and spin the tires out, you could kind of do that with modern cars, but it's different. It's the same thing with video games, especially a lot of the styles that were more popular back then. If your favorite style is like a 2D action platformer or an older fighting game, then you could just have a lot more of a choice for those. However, up until recently, if you tried to plug those old consoles into modern TVs, they either wouldn't work or it would be a terrible experience. It still is, by the way, if you plug it directly in. But if you run it through scalers or if you try to find older displays like CRT monitors, you can have a pretty amazing experience. And that's kind of what the website started about. How do you play all of these? But the scene has grown to something pretty amazing where there's new products coming out and new games and new accessories for all of these things. So that's kind of what the website and the podcast that I do has evolved into is keeping people up to date on, now there's a Bluetooth adapter, now there's an HDMI mod, now there's software called Unraid that you could use with RetroNAS to play your games over the network, which we'll still get to that in a minute, of course. But so yeah, that's kind of what I do. And my job here is to the public facing side is to do stuff like this where I do videos and podcasts and write articles, but the behind the scenes stuff is really what my favorite part and what keeps me going. I work with developers just like I did in the medical field when I was making medical grade computers with a company a while back. I kind of just say, hey, here's your product. This is amazing. Here's what people are looking for. Let's see if we could kind of tweak it and get it out there. Or maybe somebody already has something that's perfect and I just help them promote it and do a ton of testing as well, which I'm starting to do more live streams, kind of showing people what goes into these. I think with all the respect in the world, sometimes people see a 4 or 5 paragraph written review and think it's like 20 minutes worth of work. And now with the live streams, they realize it's like 7, 8 hours worth of work. So, you know, so that's kind of my spiel. That's kind of what I do. And that's kind of what led me to the Mr. FPGA project, which is something that it is like a hardware recreation of older platforms. This is a stupid analogy, but imagine Terminator 2, when the Terminator turns into whatever thing that it's becoming, a knife or whatever else. That's kind of what FPGA emulation is. these chips turn into the older consoles. FPGA devs are rolling their eyes at me, but if you're not a software or hardware dev, it's probably a good analogy to visualize it. So you get a much more accurate experience with that.
I've always been interested in the Mister. I've never actually tried it out. I think you mentioned it last time we spoke, and I've been kind of looking for it, but with the chip shortage, I still can't find it to this day. I think I saw one on eBay last night for $600, and I thought that's beyond my kind of price range.
Definitely worth taking a moment to mention that because that's a very big misconception. eBay scalpers are always going to exist. There's nothing anybody could do about that. But the heart of the Mister project is a development board from TerraSic. I don't know how you
Is it
pronounce their
the
name.
D10 Nano,
The
is it called?
D10 Nano.
D10 Nano, yeah.
So you need one of those, and you don't need, but you should also have a RAM module and a USB hub, and that's really all you would need to get started. And the RAM modules are readily available from different sellers across the world. USB hubs you get from Amazon. Just get the right one because there's a weird port. Just go to retrorgb.com/Mister. That's everything you need. But that's all you really need to get started. So going to TerraSic's website to find a D10, finding it from non-scalping resources, you're really only looking at like 220 for that. One of the very cool things that it allows is booting ROMs over the network. And, all networking applies, right? If you use slow Wi-Fi, it's going to be way less, or way slower than just plugging in an Ethernet port. But that was the other very cool thing is if you're just using the Mister and you're not using anything else, you could just set up some shares and you could set up your own symlinks if you want, which are pretty great because that way, if you want to have multiple folders in different places, you don't have to have 5 copies of the same thing. I'm assuming many people would know what symlinks are, but I guess if not, it makes your target device think it's a file,
Mm.
but it's a
It's
link to the file.
basically like a shortcut in Windows, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a good way
That's
to
how I
put it.
look at them.
But the end device does know it's a shortcut. It thinks it's
Yeah.
the file. And just like in Windows, you could put 10,000 shortcuts and it's only going to be a couple of bytes of data versus, a giant file that you have. But there's a piece of software called RetroNAS, and I hope you have the creator or creators on here at some point too. But it focuses on a lot of extra features. And one of my personal favorites is that it recreates all of the symlinks for you. So when you create this, I did a VM on Unraid and a guide by Dustin. I put that on Retro RGB if anybody wants to follow it. Hopefully you, Ed, would have time to do a video on it as
Yeah.
well, because Dustin's guide kind of assumes that you sort of already know what you're doing, and
Mm.
your videos are very easy for anybody
Yeah.
to walk
I
through.
think by the time this podcast airs, I will have a video
Cool.
releasing the same day as the podcast. I think,
Oh,
that
that's
that would be a
awesome.
good idea.
Yeah, so one of its main features is if you search the shares that are created and you go into where you store your games, they're going to be sorted by company and console, so Nintendo, SNES, whatever. But that's not the file structure that Mister or a lot of Raspberry Pi images like RetroPie or anything else, it's not what they use. So in the past, you would have to manually create all your symlinks, and if you're running a Windows server, you can't do that. It's not going to work the same or obviously just copy multiple files in many different places. But RetroNAS does it automatically. So if you connect to Retro SMB over the network or the direct IP address, then Mister thinks that it's already in the Mister's preconceived folder structure. And a Raspberry Pi image would always think that as well. So that is huge, but it also has plugins for like PlayStation 2. So you can do something like take a Raspberry Pi and plug that directly into the network jack of your PlayStation 2 and load games that way. Tito from Macho Nacho Productions recently did a great video showing that. But if you already have a server, why not just add this plugin? And then to you, all you know is that you're just dropping your PlayStation 2 ISOs here, and that's it. That's all you have to worry about. And it does all of the work. And then the only thing you need to do on the PlayStation 2 side is point it to the IP address.
Would you say that RetroNAS is a bit like Plex or Emby that serves basically ROMs and retro games to various clients like Mister and other things, in a similar way?
That is one of its features. That's the feature that I personally use the most.
Hmm.
However, there's also plugins that you could install that do things like open up older protocols, so retro computers can still connect to the internet through
Oh, that's
RetroNAS
awesome.
as a proxy. And that's, that obviously opens up some security concerns, but that's another really awesome thing about having RetroNAS run as a virtual machine on your existing server. Because if you want to, if you have computers ranging from the 80s all the way up to now and you want to try to get them all on the internet, but now you're opening up a ton of protocols, you could just shut down your RetroNAS VM until you're using it or unless you're using it.
You could put, your RetroNAS on a VLAN so it's totally isolated from your network if you were worried about these security issues.
So would you talk a little bit about how we would do that in Unraid? Would you require a PC with two network cards, or could you do that just virtually using networking protocols?
So with Unraid, for creating a VLAN, you just create it on your router, give it a tag. So basically the VLAN has a number. So for example, 20. You would then go into the network settings of Unraid, and then you would enable VLANs, and you'd create a new VLAN with the same tag, which would be 20. And then that would give you, for instance, maybe kind of BR0.20. And then you would then have that in the VM manager template to be able to assign to RetroNAS, and then RetroNAS would just be on that VLAN.
So while that makes sense, and it's certainly something I've done quite a bit in the past, I think many of us are now in a position where you're stuck using certain routers or certain equipment from your ISP. And for me personally, for the first time ever, the ISP in my neighborhood gave us a Wi-Fi and router setup that didn't suck. It's actually something I would be totally happy with, but because I got it, and they gave it free, there's no monthly fee, so it was just kind of dumb for me to say no. And but the two things are, it can't work on anything else other than their system, so I couldn't just sell it on eBay, but they locked out a lot of the other features. So for me personally, I don't have the ability to do that on the router, and as much as I would love to just go get a fancy new one, that's not where I need to be spending my money at the moment. So are there any tricks that we could use on Raid to do this?
I guess you could probably set up a virtual router as a VM. So you could set up, say, pfSense as a VM in Unraid, and then use that to do the routing for the other VLANs, and then connect RetroNAS to that.
Yeah, I think that's actually what Risha does on her network as well. I can't remember if she uses Unraid as her router or if she has VLAN or separate LANs set up like that, but that kind of made sense to me. Do you have videos on that as well?
I have a video on setting up pfSense, but it's very old, and while it's still relevant, it could do with a bit of an update. But yeah, it's
I think how to use Unraid as your router might be a really great one for people
mm,
because maybe in a situation like mine, the wireless part could still go through the other network, but everything's still kind of relying on the Unraid server for DHCP or stuff like that.
the things I don't like about using the server for my internet is if I reboot my server,
Whole internet goes down.
I get strung up by
Yeah.
everyone in the house. Yeah.
Yeah, I still think it's a pretty neat thing to think about.
Mm,
And same thing with me, right? Like I just, if I'm not home, I just, if my wife calls me and says the internet's down. Well, you know what to do. Unplug, count to 20, plug it back in. Actually, I have everything set through a UPS, so you just have to power that off and back on. But I wouldn't want to have to include other stuff. But for my crazy nerding, I would absolutely love VLANs and especially the ability to turn them on and off and stuff like that as well.
but yeah, you could have a virtual router kind of separate to your main one, kind of downstream from the main one, and there's no reason why you couldn't, and then that would be, it wouldn't interfere with your main network.
At the moment, RetroNAS, and I don't want to get too into the details of it because I think Dan and Sorek would definitely be the people to have that deep dive with. But basically, the way you would run this on Unraid now is you would load up a Fedora image, and you would have, I think it's Fedora. If I'm getting that
Is it
wrong, Debian.
Debian?
Debian.
Yeah.
Yes, sorry, Fedora was the other project I was working on through Unraid. But you would load up Debian and then you would just follow some very basic installation instructions. And yes, it's command line based, but it's Dustin did the guide and Dan did the original guide too, so that as long as you know how to follow step by step, then you're good. You don't need to know Linux in order to do this. But then you just create that, and then you create a share on the Unraid server, and then you point the RetroNAS VM to that share as if it was a mapped drive. So when you see it on your network after this is all set up, it just looks like another network drive. You don't know where it's coming from. I mean that in a good way. Like you don't have to think about where it's coming from. It just shows up as another drive to access.
So basically, RetroNAS, it links to the share on the Unraid server and then reshares that out through
Yeah.
itself.
So that's a huge thing too, because if something goes wrong with RetroNAS, or you decide, RetroNAS 2 is coming out, and I don't want RetroNAS 1 anymore. It doesn't really matter because all of those files are on your Unraid server. So as long as that is backed up, shout out to Backroom IT people. I told you I would, told you I'd wave at you during this one. As long as that's backed up, either your ROMs are also on your PC or you back up your Unraid server, you could blow away your RetroNAS installation, put in a new one, and just reinstall your plugins, and you're back up to speed in like 15 minutes. Unless you have a super slow server, maybe it'll be faster. But it's I think that's a huge deal for me. And the same would apply if you grabbed a Raspberry Pi, loaded RetroNAS on that, and plugged it into a USB hard drive. But now you're also just dealing with a USB hard drive as opposed to an Unraid server that you just access from anywhere and deal with it that way.
I suppose if you wanted to, Bob, you could install RetroNAS on a Raspberry Pi, and again, you could like link it to the share on the Unraid server. If you didn't actually want to run RetroNAS on your server, would that be a
A
possibility, do you
hundred
think?
percent, and in fact, in one of the podcasts that I do, the Q&As, we discussed this a few weeks ago because somebody kind of envisioned a scenario in which they go over and they press a button on their Raspberry Pi case, and that fires up RetroNAS, 15, 20 seconds later, or whatever else. And when they're done, they just press a button. So no logging into an interface, no pulling out your phone. It's just a very tactile, like, okay, I'm gonna go play my Mister, so let me press this button. By the time I get over to my, computer or video game setup, it's already booted, and that would absolutely work as well. The only problem with that is good luck finding a Raspberry Pi for a good price these
Uh,
days.
yeah, definitely. Another thing I was thinking when I was installing RetroNAS the other day, it using like an NFS share to connect to, I was thinking maybe we could actually set it up so we used VirtIOFS to actually connect to it to kind of get rid of the overhead of that part of the network. I find VirtIOFS, which for people who don't know what that is, it's basically you can link a VM. It works especially well with Linux, not quite so well with Windows. You can link a VM basically to a share on the Unraid server or any folder without actually having to use any network protocols at all. So then RetroNAS would then share it out through its own sharing system, but it would be
So you'd get a bit of a speed boost from that.
so it would be a little bit more efficient, I think. Yeah, so that might be something worth.
So my kind of strong opinion on this is anything you could do to make this easier for people to install should probably be priority. And if, oh, by the way, switching to VirtIO for that, where you could also get a performance boost, hell yeah, jump on that too. But at the moment, it's absolutely doable for anybody who's ever done any computer project before. But it's still not at the point, it's still not a plug and play thing. And because RetroNAS is still in a state where I don't think you could quite make it a Docker unless it's a VM inside a Docker. Could you do that?
I did try setting it up as a container, but
Container, sorry, yeah.
um, um, there were a few problems I ran into. So I think a VM for RetroNAS is, I think, because it uses like Ansible and stuff to install all of the things,
Mhm.
it's just easier to run it as a VM.
Anything that could be done to streamline that installation, especially things where you're setting up the mapping and things.
What Home Assistant does, they have like a downloadable VDisk image, and you just literally point to the image in a template that, for RetroNAS, there couldn't be a similar thing done. Obviously, you just have to have somewhere to host it where it would be able to cope with the amount of kind of bandwidth of people
Mm.
downloading it that you might get. But Yeah, that would be, very easy then because everything would be already configured. It would already be installed, and then you would use Cockpit, I think, to access it, don't you?
Yep.
Then you could go in there, change the default username and password to what you want it to be,
Yeah.
and it
Or you
would,
could SSH into it. Calm down, Linux
yeah.
people. You could still use the command prompt if you wanted to. We're not going to force you into a GUI environment, but yeah, Cockpit's probably where you're going to want to go from there.
Or you can just open a VNC window on
Yeah.
Unraid, so
There you go. I do just want to politely repeat the point, though, that let's say somebody takes the time to manually install the VM now, which really isn't hard. You just have to follow a bunch of steps and everything's working perfect. And then you come up with a very easy installer, and that's going to get updates through the installer and it's going to be easier. Just turn off the VM, and in fact, RetroNAS has backup and restore for your profiles now. So back up your RetroNAS profile, takes just a second or two. Turn off the VM, use your installer method, restore the profile, and seconds later you're back up and running, and your data is never touched because your data is all on the Unraid side of things. So do whatever you want to do to the RetroNAS side, your data is always going to be there, unless you delete your entire server through the Unraid window, but don't do that.
So this is something I can ask you. Like, I really like the idea of being able to host my ROMs and then other systems be able to access it. For me, that would be what I'd really want to use it for. What kind of like, well, I'd say real systems you can actually use with RetroNAS. I know PS2 and PS3 RetroNAS has got is the PS3 kind of like ROM server.
It will also work with the GameCube, if you use a network jack on that, and it'll also work with a lot of other things that have network. So with original Xbox, I don't think you could stream the ROMs, but you could use RetroNAS or RetroNAS to push it to the Xbox, which is a help because then you don't have to use the controller your Xbox controller to do it. Xbox 360, and there's also a couple other devices that are coming out that have this in mind. So, SED, the creator of the Fenrir optical drive emulator for the Sega Saturn, has been looking into Wi-Fi ROM loading, and that was about the same time as RetroNAS was released. So I think SED has kind of delayed the release of that to interface better with it. So that's all you basically just would make it look like all of your ROMs are on the Saturn, but they're on RetroNAS. GameCube already kind of works like that. There's a developer, Fixel Felix, who's just created an IDE drive emulator. So it will plug into anything an IDE device plugs into, and that will have an option, a purchasable option to include Wi-Fi to stream it that way. And there's also a device called the Mode that works with the Dreamcast, PlayStation 1, and Saturn that has options for a USB port. So somebody had written up a guide on how to use a Raspberry Pi Zero, I believe. You pre-configure it, plug it into the USB port, and the Mode thinks that it's a USB drive, but it's just creating a link between RetroNAS or basically any network share and that, so you're able to get your games that way. And I haven't been able to test that myself. I keep trying to trade out my Dreamcast for my Dreamcast Sports Edition for a beat up other one with a mode so that I could do this. And I just haven't found anybody that wants to do that yet. But so it's really ahead of its time, I guess, even though it's called RetroNAS, but a lot of people are jumping on board with this. So original consoles really are going to start to evolve into it. And I hope I've been talking to Crix a lot more than usual lately. He's the creator of the EverDrives, and I'm hoping that he would include a Wi-Fi chip in maybe the next revision of his EverDrives whenever those are released. I don't think he had any plans for that, but maybe we could nudge him into it.
For people that don't know what the EverDrive is, what is that, Bob?
So those are cartridges that are designed for original consoles, Genesis, TurboGrafx, Super Nintendo,
I,
whatever. That
so I've got something like, is it for people who are listening here? I've got like
Yep.
a SNES cartridge, and it has like an SD card. So basically, you can have a cartridge like this that has a Wi-Fi chip in, and you don't need to have an SD card. Is that?
That is what I'm trying to
Wow.
nudge these developers into adding because that's one of those things where it's obviously an insane amount of work to add that functionality to an existing platform. But once you add it to one, then you could kind of port that over to the rest. So I've mentioned it to Crix a couple times. Hopefully, the next time he works on a product, he'll consider adding a Wi-Fi chip. But at the very least, any optical drive emulator, I think, is way more important because, if you have a Sega Genesis, what do you need? A 64 gigabyte micro SD card? So what, a couple bucks? That's fine. You could deal with that. But when you're talking about trying to copy your CD-ROM or DVD-ROM images, that's gigabytes or terabytes, and that becomes very expensive. So that's when I really think it's more important. So that's kind of, I hope it starts from there and then trickles back down.
Yeah, even though like it's just a small SD card, I've always been the way where even if it's more efficient to do it another way, sometimes I just really love just bashing away at something to try and make it work just for the hell of it,
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
know.
But I mean, if you think about it too, right? How many of us now that are really into retro gaming would want to start off a game on one platform? So maybe you're playing it on original hardware, and then you go, okay, uh, my downstairs CRT original setup is cool, but the room's messy. Let me just finish off my game upstairs on my Mister on my flat panel. If everything is coming off of RetroNAS, you could have all of your saves there as well, so you could continue your games through that. And even if you have to manually move the save game file, if you're talking about Wi-Fi interfaces, it is easier. You could definitely do that with SD now, but then you would just undo the SD card, put it in your computer, copy it over. So that's kind of the functionality I think would be cool. And you never know, maybe you could do things like um full syncing across other devices, or either way, I just think having a centralized place for it would make it easier for most people. Obviously, if you have one console with one ROM cart and none of this applies to you, but if you start doing multiple stuff like this, then I think that's when it starts to get really cool.
So Bob, for someone who's like, not dipped their toe into the not dipped their toe into the kind of retro gaming world, would you recommend someone who wants to kind of like give it a go to maybe try out emulators first and see if they kind of like it or
Yeah, 100%. I want everybody who tries this to have realistic expectations. So if you pick up the Genesis Mini or one of the old classic NES or SNES consoles, know that those were designed for cost and for nostalgia. So they have beautiful menus and you get to see your old favorite games and hear them, but they don't play exactly the same. So I would recommend jumping into this stuff with the cheapest options possible that aren't awful. There are some awful options out there, but grab ones that aren't awful. Save yourself some money and try it. And with all the respect in the world, so many people will go and they'll play their favorite games when they're a kid and they'll spend an hour or two and then they'll go, well, that was nice. And then that's it. That's all they really wanted. But a lot of other people will go, oh, I forgot how cool this was. And oh, now I want to play this game. And oh, you know what? This isn't nostalgia. These are just the style of games I like. And those are the people that would then need to decide, do you want to emulate? Do you have a very fast computer? So software emulation, you could do it for basically free. Do you want it on an old monitor, or do you want some slightly more accurate emulation on a lower budget compared to, like a fast graphics card? Grab a Mister. Are you one of those people that just wants the original experience? You want to take that cartridge, put it in your console, you want to feel the power button go on, then use that. And you could even use them with modern displays if you're using something like a RetroTank or an open source scan converter, any upscalers that scale the image. And so there's so many right ways to do it, and you could mix and match. I have friends that like playing the Super Nintendo widescreen hacks. They don't stretch them; they render the games in widescreen on software emulation, but they also own a Mister. But they have their very favorite original consoles still with them, and there's no right answer. There's a whole bunch of right answers. Just don't get the very, very bottom of the barrel stuff. Don't get any of those Hyperkin consoles for $30 that have an HDMI port. Don't get any of those pound cables, because what unfortunately ends up happening is people don't have their expectations set correctly. So you see a device that says, plug this into your Super Nintendo and you could watch it in HD. And you plug it in and it looks cool, but like, doesn't feel right. Why is the controller sticky? Like, maybe this was just nostalgia and game really isn't that fun. But the person has no idea that the reason it's like that is because the scaling is super laggy and the video is giving them a headache because it's trying to deinterlace a non-interlaced signal. And it's one of those unfortunate things where as long as you know the very basics of where to dip your toe in the water, you could spend next to nothing or nothing if you have a good PC to start with and experience it, and then just decide where you want to go from there. Just avoid the scam solutions, which the best analogy I could always give for those scam solutions is these are entertainment products. If these were medical products or these were anything that you rely on, they would not be allowed to be sold. They would be recalled. The fact that it's for entertainment means that it could be as crappy as they want and it's not going to put somebody's safety at hand. But that's just kind of the best way to do it. But always ways to start for free.
What do you think of these emulation kind of distros such as Recalbox and things like that? Do you put any stock into people maybe trying those things out? And would
100% yes, but same thing, curb your expectations. If you put that on a Raspberry Pi 2 that you have laying around, it's not going to be an accurate and excellent experience. But you got a Raspberry Pi 4 8 GB model, or you load those distros, especially things like Groovy Arcade or Groovy MAME, and you put that on a nice PC and you just take the time to set it up right, then yeah, I think that would be a very good way to go about doing it. But also just remember, now you're spending quite a bit of time on setup. That's the kind of the thing about the Mister is people who haven't tried it scoff at the setup, but people who have actually used it realize that other than the time it takes for to update after you click and just walk away, we're talking 10 minutes, 15 minutes worth of setup.
So how do you set up a Mister? Like, if I bought the hardware, how do I say I wanted it to be a Super Nintendo?
Super easy. Just buy the D10, plug the RAM chip in, get your USB port in. Follow. I did a guide, Mister, in under 10 minutes, where you basically just take the SD card that comes with the Mister. You should probably buy a bigger one or connect it to RetroNAS, but you could start with the one that comes with it, and then you just run through a very easy step-by-step thing to image it. So you basically run an imager, then you edit a couple of very small things, and then you run an update file, and then that's it. Then all you would have to do is copy your games into the games Super Nintendo folder. And when you boot the Mister, you select console, Super Nintendo, and there you go. So as far as configuration goes, it is one of the easiest out there. Whereas a really good streamlined software emulation solution is either your keyboard and mouse are clicking to load and you hit full screen, or you're spending quite a lot of time configuring and tweaking and button mapping and all of that stuff. So all great solutions, but well, for me personally, I love the nerdy side as much as the gaming. So if I spend 10 hours tweaking an amazing setup and only spend 8 hours playing it over the course of a couple of weeks or months, I'm all right with that. But most of the people that come to Retro RGB are the opposite. What's the quickest way I could get into this? Because if I got to spend 3 hours doing it, I'm never going to play the games. So how do I jump into it? How does it not suck? And where do I go from there? So just, kind of keep the big picture in mind when you go to get started with this stuff.
Another sort of question, kind of not really related to what we're talking about as such, but how many people do you find that are interested in retro gaming are people that had the consoles and the computers as children, compared to people who maybe are born after these consoles, weren't being used anymore and are just trying these things out because I really like the analogy you gave about like an old car. There's old cars that were made before I was born, and lots of them I'd love to drive. And I'm sure that'll be the case, in the future with electric cars. You've got like kind of, the best Teslas that will do 180 miles an hour, but it might be a lot more fun to drive like a big muscle car that will only do 140. It's going to be a different experience. But so how many kind of people, younger people, would you say are coming into the scene compared to people who grew up with these consoles originally?
I think that's changing every year. When I started Retro RGB just over 10 years ago, it was mostly the nostalgia gateway drug. And, sometimes that would lead people into, yeah, this is really the games I want to play. Other times it'd be in and out in a year or so, but that is definitely changing. And I think the quality of games is really what's doing it, as well as the awareness of the difference between modern and retro. So, wanting to rediscover something that you did as a kid is cool and all, but if you're a kid who loves fighting games, but, every time you play an online match, it lags and, something errors out or there's always a problem, but you really love it. If you go play old school Street Fighter, especially something super technical like Third Strike, that's an experience right there. And I think a lot of younger people are going into that. And it's the same thing with display technology. I think people who don't really understand the differences and how displays work kind of scoff at like, oh, look at these weird people lugging around those giant CRTs, but there's no motion blur and there's no latency. And the way the image is drawn will make low resolution images look far better than they ever could possibly look on flat panels without a ton of expensive scaling equipment. So that's why we have a lot of people looking to play modern consoles even on CRTs. And you could easily do that with a PC CRT monitor, just set everything to 480p. And so a lot of people come into this hobby, or recently a lot of people have come in because of the display technology, and then, oh yeah, by the way, while I'm here, this game is awesome too, and oh, what about this older version of a modern game that I play? And so the pendulum is swinging pretty hard in the opposite direction now, where it's really, it's still nostalgia, I think, is what starts most people off, but it's really starting to become like music in cars, where this is just another option that didn't happen to be released today.
Going to sort of CRT screens, which kind of like consoles would you say look better on CRT? Would you say it's kind of like anything before maybe Xbox?
Better is absolutely subjective. What I would say is that anything that was shipped without an HDMI port is going to be so much easier to deal with on older CRTs. So there are, maybe Xbox and GameCube are right on that line where you could argue both ways, but especially because the GameCube, they both have plug and play HDMI adapters. But really, those consoles and before, if you want a good experience on a flat panel, there's a lot of things to worry about. Am I buying a scam cable or am I buying the good HDMI cable? Do I get an RGB cable and a scaler? Or well, now I'm $400 into it. Whereas you pick up an old CRT off the side of the road for free, you grab your yellow composite cable, and now you have a perfect experience with no lag. That's how they looked back then. They might not be as crispy sharp, but who cares? So I think ease of use and overall performance is really the advantage of when you talk about what consoles are better on CRTs. You could spend money on a nice OLED with BFI and a RetroTink 5X and have a better experience, one would argue, on your modern TV, but you're spending some money. So, and it's a little more complicated because you have to know which consoles do what and what needs a mod, what doesn't need a mod, whereas you just plug them all into older TVs. Also, what does tend to look better though, and this is 100% subjective, you could completely disagree and you're still right, but 2D games can scale pretty well with modern scalers. You get sharp scaling. Now there's CRT emulation filters, so it's not just lines drawn across the screen, which used to just give me a headache. Now it's actually emulating the CRT's mask, so it cuts through the image in the same way. All those are great, but old 3D graphics, PlayStation 1, N64, playing those in composite video on a CRT, the way those games were designed is to be blurred together. So I would argue that many people would probably think that those games look better on a CRT. Once again, that's 100% subjective, especially with the new scalar technology that's coming out, but that would be it. But for me personally, I use CRTs for a lot of stuff. I just was rewatching a bunch of X-Files episodes, and even though the Blu-rays are gorgeous, I think they came out great. I zero complaints watching them on an OLED TV, but watching them on a widescreen CRT, holy crap, mind blown. Everything looks amazing. And part of it is definitely the artistic side of it. When they were shooting and editing these things, video games, movies, TV shows, those were the displays they were looking at. So that's why they were mixed and color graded that way, and that's why you see a lot of stuff on like a beautiful OLED TV where you're kind of like, eh, it's not just resolution. It's that the stuff that you're seeing was not visible when they were shooting and editing these, so they didn't know how to clean it up if they would have even wanted to. So display technology is something I'm pretty into, and I do have a projector set up down there. I could just pull the screen down. And I've been kind of getting into that a little bit as well too for certain movies and stuff like that. But definitely a fan of CRTs. They are a giant pain in the ass though. They're big, they're heavy, they're all going to need capacitors replaced at some point, probably soon within the next 10 years, 20, maybe 20 tops. But it's just like old cars, right? You could go over your friend's house who's painstakingly rebuilt a 69 Camaro and you could go for a ride and love it, but do you really want to put the effort in to constantly be working on that thing? A lot of people say absolutely hell yes, and most people probably not. So, that's why I always tell both options.
I really like the video you did where you built like a kind of trolley cart and you had the CRT on there. So you didn't have to have it out as your main TV all the time. You could kind of like, wheel it into the spare room and kind of bring it out when you wanted to when you want to use it. I thought that was, a really great idea because, I've got a real lack of space, where I am, and probably the biggest CRT I could have would be a 14-inch CRT, and when you get into your 40s,
Yeah.
I don't know, I don't know, like, how great that would be,
What really surprised me the most about that, so the basic theory is you take something on wheels, you put your CRT, your two magnetically shielded speakers, you got to put shielded speakers next to a CRT or use the speakers built in, put all your consoles on it, and wheel it away when you're done. I spent so much time on that because I was trying to think what would really withstand the weight and what would make it easier to roll around. And I was using restaurant carts, I used a whole bunch of stuff. And then I kind of decided like the cheaper wire racks were good, unless you get into super heavy monitors. But the amount of people that liked it in my life shocked me. Because even like some of the snootier people that would normally scoff at something like that, you know, hey, I heard you have Duck Hunt, and I'll wheel the thing in, and they're just, I wait a minute, you get to go hide this when it's done? Because yeah, I mean it's kind of ugly. I think it's beautiful because I'm a nerd that likes that stuff, but realistically, no one else would. But you get to have this fun experience, and you get to have this cool thing, and then you just unplug it and wheel it out of the way where no one
yeah,
can see it. So even
such a good idea, Bob.
yeah,
Yeah.
even some of the nose up people were just kind of like, that's incredible. I love it. So
And with say emulation, if I was running say Box or something like that, I had a graphics card that had a VGA out. Am I going to get a better picture from an emulator if I plug that into a CRT monitor than if I used the say HDMI out of my graphics card with the emulator and plugged that into my normal monitor?
So let's assume that everything is configured perfectly and you have all of the correct accessories. Then it's exactly like taking an original console and either plugging it into a CRT or plugging it through a scaler on your TV. It's really up to preference and ease of use. If you're somebody that already has a computer connected to your PC, then or your TV, then it's kind of a no-brainer. Or if you game on a PC gaming setup, but there's options for all of these things, which I think is the most important. Like you could take a Raspberry Pi and a composite video output, configure a bunch of stuff, and have it running on a free CRT on the side of the road. So really, for $100, including the USB controller and memory card, you could be having a pretty darn accurate experience. And if you decide like this is a fun thing that I pull out twice a year for parties, perfect. If you decide, you know what, I love this, I want to go beat these games, I want to discover new games I didn't know existed. Then go back and maybe, look for a little more accurate experience or the originals if you want. But just starting out like that, I think is pretty cool. But yeah, you could absolutely even do, I wouldn't recommend them for a permanent use, but if you're just dipping your toe into the water, you could also get HDMI to composite converters and play on a CRT that way. They're laggy, but it's not as laggy as some of those scam HDMI cables. So if you're just dipping your toe in, it's
I've
fine.
got a few of those HDMI cables, Bob, and
Oh,
I know exactly what you mean. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I was disappointed. It was just like a quick and easy. I thought, oh, quick and easy way of linking up some of the consoles to
Yeah, but I mean, in your defense, how on earth would you ever know that those were scams? Because the marketing says for video games. So that's why I get so upset. Why would anybody know those things were not good when they're
And the thing is,
advertised to do that?
you read the kind of reviews on Amazon. People go, oh, they're really good, but then they're probably someone's, not to be rude, someone's mum who bought it for someone, and they plugged it in and go, oh, the picture displays, that's great, but they didn't play the game.
Right. The other problem we had for a while was there were a lot of YouTubers getting sent piles of these for free, getting paid to advertise them, holding them up and telling everybody how good they felt, and they didn't do any technical analysis. And that's kind of, I got a lot of shit for many years because I came along and I'm like, here's measurements, here's an oscilloscope, here's a high-speed camera, here's how you do it right, here's, and now a lot of those people had egg on their face. So what are you going to do? Are you going to say, you know what, I'm sorry, I was paid to do this and I didn't do my diligence? Of course not. If you're somebody that would get paid to lie about a review, you're going to double down and say, Bob's lying for attention. He's just clout chasing. Like, no, oscilloscope doesn't lie, buddy. You could
Yeah.
try yourself if you knew how to use one. So,
Like I've got a retro tink as well, one of the kind of early ones. It's probably 2 or 3 years old. But the thing I didn't like about the retro tink was if I wanted to set up multiple devices into the retro tink, I could just never really kind of get that. I think I had like an S video switcher that I tried to kind of link a few things in, but then if there was another machine that was using like composite or something, it was so hard to switch it over. What I'd like is some sort of thing like a retro tink where I could just have like 5 or 6 buttons at the front, and whatever button I press, it puts it on the right display, and I could link my console up. But I don't. Is there anything like that at all as yet?
yes, absolutely. You could piece that together if you want to get into the higher end stuff. So let's say you're not dipping your toe in, you've just dove directly into the deep end of the pool. You can get the G SCART and G Comp switches. They're expensive, but this is a get what you pay for scenario. All automatic switching. There are some lower end versions. When I say lower end, they're actually medium. They're very good. They're reliable, but not all of the crazy features that you could do that. You could start out with a manual push button switch, totally fine. Nothing wrong with that. The ones that don't power on have no chance of really, you might get some interference on the screen, but well, whatever. There's no harm that could possibly be done to your equipment. And then you would just push it that way. But there's also a scaler coming out called the Morph. And the same team at PixelFX who's making it is also making, I think they're calling it the Infinity Switch, and it all mates together. So it's you do all the control through the scaler. So that's essentially what you're talking about is you power on your console, you power on your scaler, you hit Super Nintendo, or I'm sure they might even have an auto mode. But the fact that it all ties together, you don't have to say Super Nintendo in RGB. Oh, now I'm going to go do original NES in composite, or the scaler would just know what console and what input you're using. But that's money, right? You could just also get a Retro Tink Mini and a very cheap push button switch for much less and kind of go there. So it's really just so many good choices these days. It's really the best time ever to be a retro gamer.
My brother sent me a link to a product called the Checkmate 19 IPS Retro Monitor. Is that something you've heard of?
Yeah, so I mean this respectfully. This is not a dig, but that is one of those things where you're paying for the aesthetics, not so much the performance. The person who created that, they're trying to get multiple options for panels, so they're trying to get a really high performing one. The one that they're including is fine. It's not bad. But if that's the type of product that you spend your extra money on because it kind of looks like a CRT, but you don't have any of the disadvantages. It's not heavy. You don't have to worry about calibration, and you just plug your consoles into it, and you're fine that way. So that's really one of those things. If you want both, you could get a very cheap PC monitor that has 2 milliseconds of latency and get a RetroTink 5X for about the same price and have a technically better experience, but it looks like a modern monitor. So that's really one of those options where you have to decide that aesthetics are equally as important to you, which I'm totally down for, but it is more money. So
So these things just personal choice, aren't they? Really, like
100%. Yeah.
there's no one size fits all.
No, and that's something that I've been lobbying a lot of people in the industry to try to figure out how to do. But the biggest problem is the panel manufacturers don't think the numbers are there. So what we would really love to see is a 24 to 27 inch, because they have flexible OLEDs now. So you could have one that has a very slight reverse curvature, kind of like a CRT. You could have one that runs at 120 hertz, so that you could use black frame insertion to have motion blur, reduced motion blur. You could try to get the latency down, and we could actually build that right now. for about $2,500 a panel. So in order to get that, that price point down to 500 or below, they would have to make so many, and they don't think
Right,
that the
and it's not
numbers
the
are there.
market. I
So
see. Okay, Bob. Well, I think, thank you very much for your time today. It's been really great having you on the podcast. I don't think there's anything else I wanted to ask you. Where can people get hold of you, Bob, if they want to see your work?
I am at Retro RGB everywhere. So all of the social media services, Patreon, all of those places, if you want to support. But the website, RetroRGB.com, is the main hub for everything and should point you to everything that we do, all of the amazing contributors that help out and donate their time to spread the word of all this awesome stuff. So basically find us everywhere at RetroRGB. And thanks very much for having me on. This was great. I hope that your podcast blows up and gets super, super popular, because I think Unraid is one of those things where the more people know about it, the more people are going to realize this is something they wish they'd known about a long time before.
Exactly. Well, thank you very, very much for your time, Bob. I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.